We recommend this product be installed by a competent gunsmith.
Modification of your firearm may nullify the warranty of the firearm's manufacturer.
No liability is expressed or implied for damage or injury which may occur from improper use or installation of this product.
You are responsible for the safe handling, legalities, and use of your firearm.
Warning: always wear safety glasses when working on firearms. Hey guys, today I'm here to walk you through the installation of the Apex Action Enhancement Trigger Kit for the Springfield SA-35 series pistol. This kit was designed specifically for this pistol and built here by Apex. Contents of this kit include the high tilt spur hammer, the trigger pin removal punch, a balanced sear, a sear lever that's balanced also, a sear lever biasing spring. We've got a flat wide trigger, a firing pin spring, and a mainspring. Now, the firing pin spring and the mainspring are for use in the Browning high powers only, not in the SA-35. So, when we're installing the SA-35, those springs get set aside, and those are all the parts we're going to use for the installation. Tools required for this installation are a 4-inch pillar file available on the Apex website, 3 32/2 roll pin punch, 3 32/2 flat pin punch, a flat-headed screwdriver. This is to take off the grip screws, so whatever grip screws you have, make sure you have a driver for it. Small hammer, a 5/64 roll pin punch, the Apex trigger pin removal punch, roll of tape, this will be for damage prevention on your frame, a small diamond file for potentially fitting the over travel stop if needed, and a brass or aluminum punch that's non-marring for seating the trigger pivot pin. You'll also need a sturdy bench vise. If you have the Apex magwell, you're going to need a 3/16 roll pin punch to pull the magwell off before you get started. So, if you've got our magwell, 3/16 punch added to the list of tools. So what I have here is my factory frame, and I've followed the factory field stripping recommendations for taking the slide off. I've set that aside for the time being. I've also removed the grips using the standard screwdriver. So now, the first thing we're going to do is remove the sear itself. The first thing we need to do is remove the sear itself. So the sear spring, this guy down here, the wider of the two springs up the middle, you need to reach a finger on the inside and press that spring to the back to push into the sear. You're pushing against tension. At the same time, we're going to hold the hammer back in the fully cocked position, in the overcocked position, and press in on the sear. From there, we'll take our pin punch and push it out. I'll reposition and show you how that looks. So to remove the sear, we're going to overcock the hammer and hold it down with my thumb. I'm also going to press in with my finger on the inside against the sear spring. That detensions the sear so it free floats. I'll use my pin punch, my 3 32/2, and I'll push the sear pin all the way out until it falls away. Now I can pull the sear itself out. At the same time, holding the hammer down, I'm going to switch thumbs so you can see better here. And I'm going to relieve tension on that sear spring and let it fall to the inside and pull it out of the frame. From here, I'm going to carefully, ever so carefully, relieve tension on the hammer and let it come forward. I do not want to let it go and snap forward. You'll also notice that my ejector just rotated down. That's actually one of the next steps anyway, so we'll get to that in a minute. The next step is to remove the thumb safety. I want to point out something about the thumb safety before we get into that. See this little plunger guy right here? You can see it down in the gap. That's what controls the locking up and down of the thumb safety. If you pull this guy straight out, that plunger and spring want to go shooting off into the room, and you're going to have to hunt for them for quite a while. So here's the recommendation. First thing to do is to take the ejector itself and rotate it down. You saw in the previous scene that it had rotated on its own. I'm going to go ahead and rotate it down out of our way. Once it's there, I'm going to put my finger in front of the mag release, in front of the thumb safety, and I'll press it up from the back side and see if I can get that plunger into my hand. If it won't move, you need to bring the ejector up a little bit more until it pops out of its little key. There it goes. So right now the back of the ejector, the flat is roughly flat with the back of the frame. As I push up on my thumb safety, I can pull it up and my finger is catching the plunger and spring that were in the frame that I don't want to go losing. Once I get this out of the frame, I can pull this guy up, and just for good measure, probably best to get that plunger and spring out of there so you know where they are instead of potentially looking for them later. So we'll set those guys aside and we'll get back into the frame. Next thing we're going to do is remove the ejector. With the sear out of the way as well as the thumb safety, the ejector will slide right up out of the frame. And also, the hammer and strut will also pull out. And now we can set those guys aside and we'll work on removing the trigger body itself. To remove the trigger pin, there's a couple cautions I need to make for you first. You'll notice that the trigger pin on the right side of the frame sticks up. When I flip the frame over, you'll notice that the pin is not sticking up. It's barely above flush right now. This pin is staked in from this side. You have to remove the punch, the pin itself, from the right of the frame to the left. So the high side is the side you're going to tap from. You know that punch that we included in the kit? That punch fits that pin for this purpose. So we're going to put this on a really stable surface. I'm going to go right over the edge of my tape. I'm actually going to go right into the tape initially for my impact, and then we're going to tap on it and get that pin to move. Once we get the far side of that pin to protrude out of the frame, it should pull right out, but we need to get that pin to move first. So remember, always drive the trigger pivot pin from the right to the left to remove it from the frame. I'm going to seat my punch on here. I'm going to try to keep that punch as parallel to that pin as I possibly can. I'm going to use my usual tap drive method where I give a couple quick taps to set up and then give it a drive. Check it, check the other side, I get a little movement, I'm going to do it again. In this case, I am working right over the top of the tape. My pin will press into the tape and damage the tape a little bit. You can see other little marks right here on the tape from that previously. But that's good. We actually want that tape to absorb the extra movement so the pin doesn't go flying on us or get damaged. So I'm going to do this a couple more times. Almost there. Now I feel that's pushed out more. That's definitely out. So I'm going to flip this back over. I'm going to put that over the cavity inside the tape here and see if I can get that pin to move a bit more. Carefully positioned. It's still moving, not a lot. Let's see if I can get it to move by hand. Use a smaller punch here and just manually try to give it a little push from the other side. I'm not quite there yet, so I'm going to go ahead and position this back on the tape where my pin is right near the edge of the inside so I have it the best support possible. Put my punch on there and I'm going to give it a tap. Let's see here. I'm not moving much. I'm going to go back to the apex punch here and see if I can make it drive better. Oh, it's definitely moving. So as I'm still driving, I'm just going to keep going on this guy until this pin comes out. There it goes. Now it goes right through. And now the pin falls straight out, and now I can work on taking the trigger out of the frame. Currently I have my trigger pivot pin pushed out and I'm using the apex punch to hold it in place. All I need to do, I'm going to hang on to the trigger, I'm going to pull this pin out. Has a little bit of tension back here on the spring. From there, I can take the trigger body, press it down and roll it forward, try to get this where you can see it better. Roll it forward out of the frame, and this should allow me to take everything out. And now I can disassemble that trigger and put all those components into the apex. Now that we have everything out of the frame, now is a really good time to go in and do a thorough cleaning. I would take a Q-tip and whatever else you want, go in there and clean the frame out because we're going to re-lubricate it when we put it back together. Before we disassemble the trigger, I want to go over the components that we're going to be working with so we can use the proper nomenclature. This is the trigger lever, trigger body obviously, trigger spring, and trigger spring pin. The lever will just pull up and out, no problem. We'll set that guy aside. Now we need to remove the spring pin from the trigger. We're going to set this on top of my tape roll, tap that guy out until the pin and spring come out, and then we'll replace the trigger with the apex trigger. I've got my trigger body on top of my roll of tape. I need to punch out the spring pin. So I'm going to stick my 5/64 pin punch right on top of here and just give it a few taps. Once it starts, I can normally pick it up and see if the pin will come out. It won't. I can hang it over the edge like this to tap the pin all the way through. Now that I'm through, you can see that the pin was holding the spring in. I'll pull that pin out and I can take the spring out of the trigger body and use it in the apex trigger body now. To assemble the apex trigger with the factory components, we're going to use the factory trigger spring and the factory Sear spring pin. I've got them laying here in the orientation so you can see how they go back in the gun. You're going to use the pin through the front hole here. So basically, this guy's going to go like that, and the pin will go through it on the inside. So we'll set this up and show you how it looks. With the pin partially installed, I'll go ahead and just give it a little push. In this case, I actually can use my finger to kind of tap it in place. The pin doesn't have to have a lot of tension. When it's in the frame, it'll be kept in place. But what I do want to make sure is that my pin is subflush from both sides of the trigger body once it's installed so it doesn't hang up on anything. With the trigger partially assembled, now I need to put the trigger lever in. If you notice, when I set this guy into the trigger body, it just kind of floats. It doesn't really lock in once I move the spring up. It doesn't really lock in or stay put on its own. That's fine. We're going to put that guy in, and then what you'll notice is if I put a little bit of upward tension on the front of the spring here, it actually holds that guy in relatively well. So We're going to set this aside, but I wanted to show you how it goes together so when we go put it back in the frame, it makes your life a little easier. Now we need to remove the hammer strut from the hammer. I'm going to use my 3/32 roll pin punch to tap that pin all the way through and remove it. Should be able to pull it guy right out. There we go. And now I need to get a pair of pliers and recover my pin because I pushed it too far. My fault. Now we need to install the hammer strut onto the hammer. We're going to use the hammer strut pin. I'm going to tap that guy into the hammer ever so slightly, and should be able to set it into the hole. Just can kind of start it out here. I'm going to go ahead and tap it in a little bit so it stays. I'm going to check and make sure it's not in the way. Remember, when you assemble the hammer strut, if you hold the hammer in the firing position, you want the flat edge to be forward. So flat edge of the strut, flat edge of the hammer, facing the same direction. If you put it together backward, you're going to have to take it all back apart and put the gun back together differently. So this is the proper orientation for reassembly. I've got my pin started in my hammer. I've got the strut just sitting here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this guy up on its backside, and I'm going to take my 3/32 pin punch, and I'm going to bring the strut up and capture it on the pin punch. Now, since I'm right-handed, I'm going to go ahead and flip this whole thing around so I can actually work on it better. I'm going to hold the punch, and I'm going to go ahead and give that pin a few taps with my hammer. And so at this point, I've also wrecked my little tabletop, oh well. But now I've got the pin partially installed. Now I can set it on the table flat, use my pin punch to seat that pin all the way down so that the flat edge is just barely below the surface of the hammer. I can feel that guy is now where I want it, so I'm going to flip it over, get all the schmutz from my table off of it first, and I've got plenty of subflush on this side for this pin, so I'm going to go ahead and flip it back over and go a little deeper on that pin. Make sure it is definitely subflush on both sides. Now that we're done, I'll wipe off all the schmutz from my tabletop, and I can begin the installation process into the frame. I have the trigger and the trigger lever kind of assembled. Remember I showed you before, the lever kind of falls around, so as soon as I put a little tension on it, it sticks in place. I'm going to take this and I'm going to orient it where the trigger lever is pointed pretty far down, about 2 o'clock, 2:30 kind of position here. I'm going to take this and I'm going to set it into the frame. Remember, the over travel stop on the front of the trigger and the spring have to go in. The trigger lever has to come in and then rotate up into its slot, which is on the inside of the frame right up here. So I'll try to give you the best view possible as I do this. First thing I'm going to do is bring the trigger in at a pretty steep angle. I'm going to make sure I get the 3 components, the over travel stop, the spring, and the lever, into the trigger mortise from the inside, and then fish it in and make sure it goes where it needs to go. I'm letting the trigger lever kind of rotate out toward the back of the frame as I go here. I'm going to slide this guy up in and forward, and as I rotate up, you can kind of see that I'm pushing it up and forward into position. Now, the mistake I made earlier before I was actually on camera with this is that I didn't make sure that the back of my trigger, this little square edge right here, is inside the trigger mortise before I got it into position. So I need to bring that guy up and in and back to make sure it does not come out of the frame. Now I can begin looking through the hole in the frame to align the pinholes in the frame. Once I'm almost there, now I have a little bit of spring tension I have to pull the trigger against to get the hole to line up, and that's going to be the proper orientation. So I'm going to hold this here, and I'm going to flip it over because we're going to install that pin from the left to the right. But if you notice, I've got the back of the trigger sticking out again, so I got to pull that guy, back up into the frame, make sure my lever is in place, and then I can work on aligning my hole on the frame so I can put the pin through. This will take a little bit of work, and it's really hard to show on camera while I'm aligning it at the same time. So you need to align the hole in the trigger body with the frame. And what you can do is you can put your pin through from the right side to the left as a slave pin to kind of lock things in, and then you can put the pin punch in. So we'll go over that part next. I'm holding the trigger body so you can see through the hole in the frame. As I move the trigger body down, you can see the hole kind of clear itself out. You're never going to get all the way through because the spring for the trigger is actually going across the hole, which is going to capture the pin. So I'm going to take my pin punch. I'm going to go in from the right side of the frame, come across, and capture the trigger bar and everything, body in place. From here, I can do a quick sample articulation of the trigger. And when I do so, you can see this trigger lever popping up the way it's supposed to, and it's got a little bit of tension like it's supposed to have. So we'll get the pin in next and show you the proper recheck of those components. I want to show you the trigger pin one more time just to make sure we're clear on it. One end has a taper, the other end has a minor chamfer. the one with the taper on it is going to go in first, from the left side of your frame to the right. The way I have the frame oriented now, I have a pin punch in from right to left. I'm going to put that pin across, and it's going to drive my pin punch out when I push it into position. So again, taper end goes in first from the left side of the frame to the right. So all I got to do, basically push that pin out with this guy and give it a little wiggle on occasion where it needs it to help with the spring and the pin. It goes about halfway across and it's going to stop. No problem. From here, I'm going to take a pin punch. This is just a aluminum punch, or it could be brass. I wrapped in 2 layers of tape on the end to give it a nice smooth surface because I don't want to damage my frame. I'll take that and my hammer and I'll give this a little tap, and that should override the spring. There it goes. Now I can do a quick test. I'm going to grab the trigger body and make sure it articulates. It does. Everything is moving properly. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and tap this pin all the way down until it's flush with the left side of the frame. A little high still. So I'm wobbling around quite a bit here. I'm going to go ahead and take my tape roll. I'm going to put that right over the supported surface of the tape and give it another good whack. Okay. Now it feels like we're flush. From the other side, the pin does stick out. And now we can check the trigger body function. We can also check the trigger lever pops up as it needs to. You can see right there on the locking block. It pops up when we pull it, and it releases when it goes down. So we're good to go on that. We'll take the tape off and we'll start putting the hammer back in. So I've got a quick simple view here for you of how the hammer and strut go back into the frame. One thing to be aware of, there's a little slot in the frame here on the inside that the strut has to go through. The spring seats on the inside of that slot. So I'm going to take my strut on the hammer face, flat face, facing forward of course, drop it into the frame, and I'm going to make sure that that guy hooks into the frame. I'm going to bring the hammer body up, bring the spring forward and in. Oh, I'm going to drop the bottom in first down here. Bring it in, and now when I pull on it, I'd be pulling against spring tension. Now my hole at the top is almost lined up. I need to grab the ejector, and I need to put that in next. The ejector orients like so in the frame with the long tab going forward. So I'm going to take that guy, I'm going to rotate it downward, drop it into the frame, and rotate it around so that I'm pretty well lined up in there with the hammer. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our thumb safety and use that as the hammer axle to lock everything in place. I'll show that from another view. So I've got the thumb safety here, and I've got the shaft of it that acts as the hammer axle right here. On the end of that, there's what's called a key, and it's basically just a piece of metal sticking up that acts to orient rotationally to other parts. In the ejector, I'm going to pull the ejector back out here so you can see it. There is a rectangular slot in the ejector that key essentially goes into and then allows it to stay in place. So we need to orient the ejector. I'm going to put it right back in here next to the hammer. We need to orient that roughly vertically, so right about where I have it, again, where the back of the ejector is flush with the frame. And I'm going to take my hammer strut, which is also the thumb safety, with that key facing upward, and I'm going to drop that guy into the frame and just capture the hammer and the ejector. From here, I can double check orientation. So I'm going to turn it up on end so you can see it a little bit better here. And then from here, I'll get the ejector rotated up, and then I should be able to get this guy all the way back in. Now, you'll notice I did not put the plunger and spring back in. That's fine. This is a test fit to confirm everything is right before I go putting the springs in, which are more difficult to handle. I've got my plunger and spring here for the thumb safety. Currently, they're not installed. The thumb safety just kind of flops around. What I'm going to do is I'm going to confirm that my hammer strut is in the right spot and that my hammers were assembled right. So just as a good measure, I'm going to grab my ejector, rotate it up into its position, and hold it there with my fingertip. I'm going to grab the hammer and pull it back, and I'm going to watch and make sure that in here I've got the hammer strut against the frame, which I do. When I pull the hammer back, it should compress the main spring like so. Yeah. See compressing the spring? That's confirmation that I have it properly assembled. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put my plunger and spring together. It's just a pretty simple little assembly here, nothing crazy. I'll set that aside. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my ejector back down so it'll release the thumb safety. Pull this guy back up only as much as I need to get clearance on the hole on the front of the thumb safety. I want to show you that the hole on the front of the thumb safety right up here is where the plunger and spring that I pulled out earlier go. So I'm going to use my punch here to help kind of lift the thumb safety up a little bit. I don't want to go too high. I don't want to pull it all the way out. I want to have it partially in. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and tip the frame up, and so I can expose the hole in the thumb safety. And try to hold this guy so you guys can see what I'm doing here. But I'm going to try to drop the plunger and spring into the hole. There we go. Now it's in position. Now, this is where we have to be careful. That plunger can make a nice big mark on your frame if you're not careful. My recommendation is to put it against the frame where it's just touching ever so slightly. Make sure our hammer and stuff are in the right position. Make sure I've got my ejector rotated where it's roughly flat with the back of the frame. I'm going to push that guy in gently. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to use my pin punch and push on the front of that plunger. And I'm putting like a 1/4 pound of weight on the top of this thumb safety. I'm going to put a little bit of pressure in and down, and it should drop the thumb safety right in to the frame. With a little bit of a wiggle, it popped right in. You can hear the click a second ago. That's good. From here, I'll bring my ejector back up. That'll prevent the thumb safety from coming out. And now I can confirm thumb safety function. It does tick, it does click and lock into position on both spots. This is good. Now we're going to reassemble the sear. Next, we're going to install the sear pin, and sear spring. This is where it gets a little tricky because I need to put the sear spring back in first and then put the sear on top along with the pin. So let's go ahead and get into this. I want to point out that there's a little boss on the bottom of the spring that locks into the inside of the frame down here. You can kind of see it right down there at the bottom. So there's a little round hole at the bottom we're going to put it into. But first, to do that, we have to cock the hammer back to get the strut out of the way. So what I need to do, I'm trying to do this real carefully, I'm going to press the hammer all the way back to what we call the overcocking position, where it's too far. I'm going to take my spring in from the bottom, fish it into position, and then carefully put that little boss into the hole while I bring the front of the sear spring back against the frame. Once I'm there, I can gently let the hammer forward. And once I've done that, now the sear spring will stay in place. So this is how it's supposed to look. You'll have the little boss sticking here with a sheet metal here at the back. And then you'll also have the strut, the sear spring in front of everything else. And you have the spring over here, and you've got the strut in the middle. Now I have the sear spring in place. We're going to drop the sear itself and the pin in. This is where it gets really difficult because I have to hold force against the sear spring, which is rather powerful, and the mainspring, which is very, very strong. So here's my method. I'm going to do what I call the pinch method. I'm going to put 3 fingers on the inside of the frame, 2 of which are on the top of the sear spring. The other one is just down here for support and for moral support. I'll take my thumb and I'll bring the hammer back as far as I can and hold it into that overcock position. Now I'm holding the spring in on the inside and I'm holding the hammer back. From here, I need to drop the sear in. And in this case, the flat that has just a little facet on top, you can see in the reflection there, that goes right up against the hammer, basically into, kind of visually into that orientation. Now I'm going to take my sear pin, I'm going to put it in from the left side to the right so I can capture the ejector so it doesn't rotate out of position anymore. Dang it, that didn't work. Okay, let's push that pin back about just to clear the ejector so it stays in place. I'm going to grab my sear, and now I have to hold the top of the sear spring really tight against the hammer. Drop my sear in, and from here I can push against that sear pressure to get it in place. Once I close the gap between the sear and the hammer right up there, I can then push the pin across. I'm going to angle the frame up a little bit, and I'm going to hold on real tight and try to use my pin punch to capture the sear. There it goes. I've captured the sear now. So from that perspective, now I can push the sear pin across, wiggle it in. Now it's catching the sear. I can pull this out this side, and I'll push the pin in to capture the sear. Once I'm all the way across, I'm going to double check I'm not sticking out the other side or didn't fall all the way through. Now I can relieve tension on both the hammer strut and the spring, and now I've got the hammer in its fully cocked position. To double check that I am in the right functional spot, when I pull the hammer back, you'll see a gap open up between the sear and the hammer. That gap tells you that everything is moving right. Now, the only way to trip the sear right now is to press down on the little top tab that the trigger components hit on. Here's the problem. If I press on that now, my hammer's going to fall forward. We don't want to do any damage. So I'm going to hold the hammer back, press the sear down against spring force, and let the hammer up slowly to confirm it works. When I bring it back, you'll hear it click. That's the safety notch. That's the single cock notch, and now it's ready to fire. So this is the orientation we're going to be in. And now our frame is fully assembled. Now we can put the grips back on, the magwell, whatever we have, and now we can work on the slide. Starting in on the slide, we're going to take out the sear lever. That's this guy right here. It goes along the side, and this is what connects the trigger to the sear and makes the gun fire. So this lever here from the factory has a little arrow. I'm going to push it up here so you can see it better. A little arrow here at the back. The Apex component has the same feature, so you want to make sure that's at the rear of the slide when you reinstall it. As you'll notice, when I push this down, the sear lever is relatively below the strip rail, right in the center of the slide. That's intentional to make sure it functions. I'm going to use my 3/32 inch roll pin punch to remove the pin from the slide here that takes out the sear lever. Now remember, when you pop out the sear lever, that exposes the roll pin for the extractor. So if you need to remove the extractor for cleaning or replacement, you have to push this pin out. So now, while you have this out, is a really good time to clean your extractor and replace it or put it back in. First thing I want to do is identify how deep I want to go with my pin. I'm holding my pin right here where it's just past the edge of the strip rail. So I'm going to mark that with my finger, and I'm going to take a piece of tape here and just make a little flag on the side of my pin punch. The idea is I can put that against the frame, and now I know when that little flag touches the slide, I've got the pin far enough out to get the sear lever out, but the pin doesn't have to come all the way out. So I'm going to roll this down, and I'll take my hammer, and I'll go ahead and punch that pin down until my flag touches the slide. Let's go ahead and tap the sear lever out here. My flag is pretty much touching the extractor, so at this point, I can pull the pin back out, and now I should be able to just, there we go, sear lever comes right out of the frame. Now, again, this is a very good time to go ahead and clean the slide and the components before you put it back in. I want to give you a quick side-by-side of the Apex component versus the factory. You'll notice the Apex component has a spring we include with it. This is normally not sitting in the lever, it's normally in the package with the parts. But you'll notice that the Apex lever has some holes drilled in it. That's not just for looks. We're not doing it to look like a 1970s muscle car. What we're actually doing here is balancing the component. What we wanted to do is make sure that the pivot point is the central pivot axis. So the mass on both sides is equal. We also use the spring here as a bias to keep the lever in position, deactivated until you pull the trigger to activate it. This is part of our drop safety feature that we built into this system to maintain the factory drop safety values. I want to give you a quick demonstration of how the sear lever goes back in the frame, or in the slide, I should say. You'll notice that the tab, again, is at the back closest to the rear sight, and the spring is on top at the front. So it's going to go in just like this. All I'm going to do is I'm going to take this guy, slide it into the slide, and make sure it goes all the way down. Oh, I also want to point out, just for good measure, that we're only going to use the hole closest to the spring for mounting. We're not going to try to go in this guy. It goes in the central hole that's closest to that spring. So I'll take this, slide it into the slide. I can see the hole is basically lining up here. So I'm going to take my flat 3/32 punch, the one that's not a roll pin punch. I'm going to put that in from the right side where the extractor is and capture that lever. I'm going to use my other pin to demonstrate for you the spring function. So right now, if I press on the lever, the spring carries it up. It lets the little tab here come up past the strip rail, and when I release it, the spring pushes it back. That biasing spring needs to function, so you need to check this when you install it. Now, we need to put the coil roll pin back in from the left side of the slide back in position. However, I want to point out, the pin has to go past the rail. I'm going to take this tape off here. This is kind of in the way. The pin itself has to go past the ejector slot in the slide. That's this little slot right here. So if you can see the pin in that slot, it's no good. You have to push past that. So I'm going to hold this on my tabletop, on my roll of tape here. I'm going to put the pin onto my roll pin punch onto my coil pin. And I'm kind of doing a multi-hand hold here, but I'm going to hang on to this guy. And I'm going to tap the pin across until it captures my sear lever. Now, you can also do this in a bench vise. It would make it a little easier at times. I'm trying to do this in a more common way for most people to do if they don't have the right tools. As I tap this across, I can feel it pushing my other pin out. Right now, if I pull the pin out on this side and the lever moves, which it didn't, that should mean that my coil pin is holding the lever in place. I'll test it right now. It does pivot on that pin. So now I can leave my other pin out. And I'm going to go ahead and tap this guy down a couple of taps. And I'm going to check the clearance from the pin to the strip rail. I can still see it in that slot. So I'm going to keep going until it clears the ejector slot. Now I barely see it. I don't know if you can see it on film right there, but I can just barely see it hanging out right there. So I'm going to go ahead and tap it a little further. And I'm going to check and make sure that that is absolutely clear. You can also use your little 5/64 punch. It's probably too wide. Probably use a 16th punch if you've got something to go in and just check the rail and make sure it's not there. I can visually see it is below flush ever so slightly. I'm going to check the other side. I have a little space still to my serration, so I'm going to go ahead and give it another tap just for good measure. Felt it move just a little. Now I'm definitely subflush inside the rail. I'm also subflush on this serration, and now I'm good. I'm going to do a final check to make sure that my sear lever does function and is spring-loaded like we want it to be. And when it's at rest, I'm going to flip it around here so you can see better. When it's at rest, I want that tab below the strip rail like it is here. That's a proper assembly. Now we can put it all back together and check it out. Now that we have the frame and the slide reassembled, I'm going to do some lubrication. The way I recommend lubricating this pistol is plenty of lube on top of the rail. I'm using a needle oiler with a really good quality gun grade lubricant. I don't care what you use, just don't use bacon grease. So I'll put a blob on top and I will push it away with my finger and then use my finger to carry it back onto the side of the rail. That'll normally carry the lube underneath as well. So I'll do that on all four corners, pushing the lube onto the rail. And remember, you want to lubricate the top of the rail, the outside, and the underside. If you can't get enough in with the finger method, you can also use a needle oiler to come in and add some underneath the rails on all corners as you need to. Yes, you can over lubricate, but really, in all reality, guns are built for dirt clearance, and lubrication falls into the dirt category. So lubrication will fill the mechanism and then it'll slide out. Yes, you're going to be greasy, but it'll function. So remember, you need to lubricate things. So 4 frame rails. I also put a drop or 2 right here at the sear interface to make sure it stays nicely lubricated. And I also do some on the locking bar across the inside where the barrel hits. Really, you want to get kind of the underside of that guy too. So the bar here and the 4 rails, and then right on top of the sear and hammer. On the slide, I don't do anything on the slide itself. I leave it as it is. The barrel itself gets lubricated. What we do there, you got the locking lugs up here. I just put a big stripe right across the lugs and let it flow down both sides, kind of move it around here. We want to get it into the locking lugs. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to do the bottom of the locking area so as it goes in the frame, it's smooth. And then on the barrel, roughly about 3/8 to a half an inch from the front, put a blob on top and 360 all the way around. That's adequate lubrication. You can slather all the oil or whatever you want on here, but that's really all you kind of need. So I'll go ahead and drop this guy in, put it all back together, and I'll show you the function. Quick reminder for you, the recoil assembly looks like this when it's properly installed. The 2 holes line up. You can flip it over and it'll go on, but it won't go in the gun properly. So make sure you align the recoil guide rod and the barrel properly so you get mostly a hole there. The little pin on the inside that you can see, the little ball from the inside there, that locks into the takedown lever to keep it in place. So make sure you have this before you put it back on your slide. So I have everything reinstalled. We're going to do a couple of function checks. First thing I'm going to do, of course, is make sure my gun is unloaded and there's no ammunition because, again, we're using and messing with an unloaded gun in a safe condition. Again, I'm pointing in a safe direction, a known safe direction, so while I'm doing this. So first thing I want to do, put my thumb safety on and make sure I can't fire. It does not fire. Thumb safety off, I am able to fire. So I'm also going to hold the trigger, cycle the slide, hammer stays. When I reset and re-engage, it does fire properly. I just need to make sure that the thumb safety works properly. So with the hammer cocked, I'm going to press the thumb safety up, make sure it locks in and back down. If the thumb safety does not fully come up and engage like it's supposed to, you may have to trim some material off the hammer axle on the safety notch, and I'm going to have to pull this back out and show you how that goes just in case you have to modify it. In this one, I don't have to modify it, so I'll demonstrate on the surface with a pen and show you exactly what surface to work on if you need to. Reminder, you're going to be modifying this surface, and I want to caution you, take it slow, take little bits off at a time, put it back, try it again, rinse, repeat. Try to maintain the same angle you see on this face. Basically, if you rotate this guy around, you can see the angle between the front face and the top. Keep that angle where it is. Just take little bits off at a time. And please, please, please do not use a powered rotary tool. You need to use a file and do this by hand. Don't use something that rotates that's going to spin and take a bunch of meat off. Little bits at a time until it just slides into position. That's the proper fit. Here's what the safety face looks like when it's been properly fitted and when it's been hand filed with a pillar file like we have in our instructions. So that's what it should look like when you're done. Little dusting, deburr, take a little edges off if you need to, but don't round it off or anything like that. Try to keep it as square as possible like it was and take little bits off until it fits the frame properly. And then you're done. So we have everything installed, and now we need to do a final check of the over travel to make sure that the sear is getting up out of the way of the hammer appropriately. So what we're going to do first, again, unloaded gun. I've checked it's unloaded. There's no magazine, no ammunition. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hold the hammer down all the way overcocked. I'm going to pull the trigger and hold it down as well. I'm going to slowly lower the hammer, and I'm going to feel for any kind of resistance that stops it from going forward. Basically what I'm checking for is a stop on the safety stop notch. So if I have the hammer forward and I pull it back without pulling the trigger, I'll pull back ever so slightly. That click right there, that's the half cock notch. That's the safety notch. When I go back further, that's the single action notch. So I need to make sure when I hold the hammer down and I pull the trigger and hold it, I can pass both notches cleanly without an interference or a slowdown. If it does slow down, what that tells me is I need more over travel, in which case we would have to modify the trigger. I'm going to take the factory trigger now and show you what surface to modify on the apex trigger if needed, instead of pulling this one back out. I want to point out inside the frame, this is the muzzle is pointing that direction. This is the top of the trigger itself on the inside with the slide off. This little tab right here, opposite the spring for this, here's the spring for the trigger, here's the front of the trigger itself. When I pull the trigger, that tab articulates down, and that is the over travel stop that stops the trigger body from moving after the break. If your single action or your safety notch are hitting the hammer like I just described, that's the surface on the bottom of here is what we have to modify. So I want you to see how it functions in the gun, and I'll take the other trigger, I'll pull it out, and I'll show you what it looks like and what surface to modify next. So here's the factory trigger out of the gun. Remember, we're fitting the apex trigger, but I just used the factory one here for this demonstration. This tab that sticks out right here is the over travel stop. Specifically, the bottom surface here, from there to there, is the over travel stop. So if you need to modify and take material off, you'll take it a little bit off this at a time. Remember to keep it as flat as possible and as at the same angle this direction as possible when you take it off, take material off. In this case, the trigger body itself is finished in a coating that has a very, very hard shell. So you need a diamond file. In this case, I'm using an Easy Lap diamond file. You can use any kind of a diamond file to cut it, but most files, most Swiss files or standard files like you get at a hardware store will not cut the surface on the apex trigger body. So you're gonna need to use a diamond file to do that. And my method is just to hold it basically like this and take a file and just take little swipes, a couple of swipes at a time. But again, do not use a rotary powered tool. You wanna do this with a diamond file by hand. And remember, you're gonna get very familiar with taking your gun apart and putting it back together to fit this, but that's not a bad thing. This is your gun. Why not know how to work on it and maintain it yourself? We're gonna run through a final function check after we've fitted our over travel stop as well as our safety. So again, I'm doing this with an unloaded pistol, no ammunition, no magazine present. I have the hammer cocked in the firing position, thumb safety is off, it fires. I'm gonna rack the slide, with the trigger down, I'm gonna reset, and it fires again. I'm gonna cock the hammer back, thumb safety on, it locks in nicely now, no fire, thumb safety off, and it fires. This is proper function. At this point, I can also double check the hammer, so I'm gonna pull the hammer back all the way down to overcock, pull the trigger and hold. I'm gonna slowly drop the hammer forward and make sure it doesn't stop on the sear. It's completely clear, so I've got all my clearances. At this point, my gun is done and I'm ready to take it to the range. Hey, thanks for watching. If you have any questions about your installation or any issues, contact our customer service. That's what we're here for.